So today we're going to have my good friend and co-worker, Karen Mihal Phillips. She is actually the Director of Communications for the Hunters Leadership Forum. She is going to do a little brief introduction and introduce our panelist for today. So I'm going to turn it over to Karen and let her take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome, everybody. As Peter said, also a special thank you to the Council to Advance Hunting in the Shooting Sports. I'm Karen Mihal Phillips, Director of Communications for the NRA Hunters Leadership Forum, Senior Editor of NRA's American Hunter, and Editor of the HLF's website, nrahlf.org. Before we begin, I want to say a few words about the HLF site. For anyone who is not aware, we hunters have this tool in our toolbox. The NRA launched this national award-winning site in 2016 prior to beginning talks on the HLF-funded research project with Mark Damien Duda and responsive management. This site specifically monitors news on the issues impacting the future of hunters, hunting, and wildlife conservation on the state, national, and international levels. In addition, material shares the stories of hunters and hunting and explains how poaching is not hunting, how legal regulated hunting benefits wildlife, and how hunters are ethical, compassionate, mainstream all-Americans whose dollars aid game and non-game species alike. Please visit nrahlf.org, scan the topics covered over the past few weeks alone, and share the story links. Sign up for our bi-monthly e-newsletters and social media alerts, and contact me with story ideas. Every hunter and every hunter-backed agency and organization has a compelling story to tell. Email me yours at kmehall@nrahq.org, KMEHALL@nrahq.org. As for how to talk about hunting and be tactical, practical thinkers, we've never had the tools to do this effectively until now. Thanks to the research data, the HLF book, and these webinars, we know where to go from here and how to start the conversation. I'm excited to introduce today's speakers. Armand Revelins is a director of policy debate at Cornell University, where he also teaches a course in advocacy and debate. He teaches critical thinking and research skills that are then applied in competitive intercollegiate debates nationwide. In addition to adjudicating hundreds of formal debates, he has trained a variety of stakeholders in the techniques of persuasion and directs a summer camp focused on debate and communication strategies. Armand won the high school tournament of champions for debate, was a successful intercollegiate debater at the University of Southern California, and received a master's from the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. He joined John Stowell and Sam Nelson's A-Game Debate Prep Company in 2020. Sam Nelson is a senior lecturer at Cornell University, where he teaches courses in advocacy, rhetoric, and debate, and directs the speech and debate program. He has taught persuasive communication strategies and tactics for over 30 years at top universities. In 2020, Cornell awarded him the Harry N. Stern Award for teaching and mentoring. In 2019, with his friend John Stowell, he founded the consulting company A-Game Debate Prep. To have policymakers, public figures, public servants, political candidates, and all advocates be their best at crafting and delivering their persuasive messages. We are fortunate to tap into their expertise and Mark Damien Duda's. We've got the masters to help us build cultural acceptance for legal regulated hunting. So let's begin the third of our 4 HLF webinars.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was a great introduction. What we want to talk about today is persuasive communication. In the last webinar, Mark was fond of saying, it's not what you say, it's what they hear. I thought that was one of the great takeaways from his presentation that I got out of it. And what I'm fond of saying in my classes at Cornell or in these kind of webinars or when I'm doing consulting with whole wide range of different kinds of people and trying to make them better communicators, better advocates, better at getting their message across. I'm fond of saying the truth does not speak for itself. And what I mean by that is you have to do your very best to try to get messages across. So what I'm going to talk about today is how to structure basically a persuasive appeal Basically, what I want to talk about is what's a good way to make an argument? What's the best way to make an argument? Whether you're working with someone individually, or you're working with a group, or you have a national or international campaign. And the first thing that I want to talk about is what I call the pecan system. Actually, it's not me that calls it this. It's two professors from the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School of Business. Their names are Richard Schell and Mario Musa. And they wrote a great book a few years back called The Art of Woo. And right up there with how to talk about hunting, The Art of Woo is one of my favorite books. And what it is it's using strategic persuasion to sell your ideas. And these authors came up with 4 steps that all the best persuaders, whether they be car salesmen or Hollywood executives or politicians or you name it, they kind of, everybody that's really effective kind of uses these 4 steps, whether they know it or not. And I'm going to go over those 4 steps, and I'm going to urge you to try them out and use them in whatever field or situation that you might find yourself in, especially if it's about advocating a sort of a pro hunting mindset. The first thing that you need to do if you want to persuade someone is you need to explain to them that they have a problem. People don't get motivated unless they think they need to fix something. It's just the way people are. We tend towards inertia. So what you need to do is you need to explain that there's a problem out there. And the anti-hunting groups, the groups that would mislead people and explain that hunting is bad in a whole wide range of ways, the first thing they do when they sit down and they're brainstorming, and I've read articles about this when I was doing research for this presentation, is they try to find a problem. They try to find a victim. They try to find a villain. They need to have a problem. And so you should do the same thing. In Mark's presentation the other day, he had a problem. People weren't talking about hunting in the right way. They weren't using their data correctly. They weren't doing the best they could possibly do in terms of communicating the good things about hunting. That was the problem. The next thing that you need to do, according to Schell and Musa in their book, The Art of Woo, is you need to explain the cause of the problem. And the cause really goes back to something that Mark was talking about in terms of ethos, pathos, and logos. Remember, ethos was credibility and trustworthiness. Well, when you can explain why the problem exists, then you really help your credibility and your trustworthiness. You've basically established that you understand the problem other than just noting it's a problem, that you understand why the problem exists. Mark did a great job of this the other day when he explained what the data shows, what certain groups and what the population thinks about certain ideas and likes certain things and doesn't like other things. That information is ammunition, is data that can be used to back up an argument and establish trustworthiness and credibility. So the cause is really important in terms of the next step in the system. The third thing that you need to do is provide an answer. It doesn't really help if you just note problems and know that you know why the cause of the problem, you know why the problem exists. What you really need to do is get to that next level and say, and here's what we need to do about it. This is called don't forget the ask. What do you want people to do about the thing that you think is a problem? And this is your solution. And there's all different kinds of solutions. This webinar in itself is a bit of a solution because what people are asking you to do is to think strategically about how you talk about hunting when you are in situations where you can do such a thing. And so the answer needs to be clear and effective and doable. And so whenever you employ the PCAN system, problem, cause, answer, net benefits, that Schell and Musa talked about, you definitely need to make sure that you include the answer. The last thing, the net benefits, is actually, to me, the most interesting part of this 4-part system that they came up with. Because what it is about is adding the icing on the cake. Not only do you explain, if you do this correctly, do you explain what the problem is, what the cause of the problem is, what the answer they should do, but then you explain what are the additional good things that would happen should they do what you're advocating that they do. Should they accept the answer and start employing that in their life, right, or deploying it in their life. And what research has shown is the more of these things that you have, the more additional good things that will happen, the more likely you are to persuade someone. It's interesting when you go buy a car, one of the first things that you often see is the sticker on the side of the car. And one of the longest lists on the sticker, I don't care what car it is generally the accessories. People will buy cars that just have a long list of accessories. They hardly even spend any time reading what the accessories are, what the additional things are. They just like a lot of extra stuff. That's the nature of human beings. Well, that's true with the net benefits as well, the additional good things that will happen. So not only may we be more persuasive by using some of these strategic persuasive ideas, but perhaps it will help us in other areas as well, in terms of retaining membership, maybe increasing the number of people that actually are interested in trying hunting, maybe making it easier for our allies in the political realm to follow our arguments and perhaps make them themselves. These are all additional reasons why they should adopt your solution, whatever it is. So if you're ever in any kind of persuasive setting, in a setting where you want to use strategic persuasion, what I advocate that you do is think PCAN, problem, cause, answer, net benefit. And just say that to yourself in your head, or when you're thinking about a problem strategically, just write out what's the problem that we want people to address. What's the cause of the problem? What's the answer to the problem? What are the net benefits? And I think it will really put an interesting framing to whatever the issue is you're dealing with. The next thing I want to talk about is something that I actually came up with. And I'll tell a little story. So at Cornell University, they make all incoming freshmen take a course in dialogue. It's the new cool thing these days, and to make sure everybody can talk to each other. And one of the things that the pro dialogue folks teach is they call it LARA. The L stands for listen, the A stands for affirm, the R stands for reflect, and then the last A is add, or add your own ideas. And that's great if you're just trying to, make sure you don't offend anyone. But occasionally you just need to beat someone in an argument. And that's where I came up with my alternative to Laura. When you're not trying to have a dialogue, you're just trying to win an argument. And I call it IBM, and it's easy to remember. And the first thing, and by the way, in a lot of my consulting, I'll be helping people that are running for office, policymakers or politicians or public servants, and I'll teach them the strategy for when they're at press conferences, because that's a bit of can be an argumentative situation. They want to make themselves clear at the very least. So this is a system that I developed that I very much have seen work. So the first thing you need to do is you need to identify what you're talking about. We've all been in situations where someone answers a question or someone's making an argument and you're a little confused as what part of the question are they answering, or what are they really getting at here? What's their point? And so when you identify on that issue or on the issue of X, or when we're talking about deer, or when we're talking about hunting in general, or when we're talking about turkeys, identify what you're talking about. Because what will happen is people, nefarious people that don't really want you to succeed, will identify for you if you don't identify for yourself. So always identify what you're talking about. That may mean if you're in a press conference or in a situation where you're being interviewed, that you re-ask the question to yourself You say, oh, that's an interesting way of phrasing that question. The way that question speaks to me is this, and then you say what the question you want to answer, right? But don't feel like, and we've all been in these situations, we don't really understand the question, but we try to answer it anyway. We're trying to be a good guy. We're trying to, accommodate the person that's answering the question. And it's better just to identify exactly what you're talking about. The second thing you need to do, and this is where you get down to the nitty gritty, is you need to beat the argument, not the argument they made, the very best argument that they could have made. So oftentimes I advise people to say, that's an interesting point you make. I thought you might have done this, this, and this to make it even stronger. But even if you had done that, right, here's why my position still stands. So this is where you get to the meat of your strategy, where you basically say, here's why my argument is better than your argument. There's no listening. There's no affirming. You know what they're getting after. There's no reflecting, right? What you're doing is just explain why your argument is better. And this is the nature of persuasion. People want to know why one argument is better than another. And then the last part of the IBM system is mean. And people are just like, oh, you need to be mean to people? No. Don't be mean to people. What you should do is you should explain what it means, why it matters. You answer the question, so what? That's the big issue that you need to always bring home after you make an argument. You need to identify what you're talking about. You need to beat the argument and explain why your position is superior to whatever theirs is. And then the final thing that you need to do is you need to explain why it matters. Again, answering the question, so what? This means that we'll now have money for safe, legal, regulated hunting. This means now we'll actually have money that will allow for different wildlife, game, animals to live in a thriving way, as opposed to be threatened. This is very important. This is called impacting your argument, and it's probably the most important part of the IBM system. So those are just two things that I want you to think about: the PCAN system, the problem, cause, answer, net, benefit. Use that in any strategic persuasion setting. And then the IBM system, which is whenever you're arguing or discussing something with somebody and you want to just stay on track, you want to get to the point, I say use this IBM system. Identify, beat, and then explain what it means. Armand?
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so now we'll turn to the number 2 out of 4 of our major things we're going to talk about, which is deploying arguments for effective persuasion. And I want to kind of analyze an instance where there's a communicative interaction and what goes well, what works, what doesn't. So this is a more dynamic analysis where you might be in a conversation with somebody, you might be on television getting interviewed, any sort of context like that. So there's one big tactic that I want to emphasize here, and it's going to show up on the next 2 or 3 slides, the same thing, because I want to drill it into your minds to remember it, which is that effective debating really requires that you prioritize offense over defense in what are time-limited contexts. And I'll explain what each of those mean, right? But you need to emphasize offense and prioritize that in your argument repertoire before you get to any defensive arguments. And that's important because of time-limited context. So what do I mean? Why are contexts time-limited? Well, first of all, it might be because of the rules of the game. This webinar, for example, is an hour long. If you're asked to do an interview on a TV show, you might just have 5 minutes to do an interaction. If you're invited to be part of a roundtable discussion, they might give each speaker a certain number of minutes that they're allowed to talk. In other words, the clock is always ticking, so you can't just ramble and not prioritize your best arguments. You really need to get at the heart of the matter quickly on what is actually going to persuade people, convince people, and win the debate. There's another reason why time contexts are limited, and it's because the norms of business and political interaction. Typically, when somebody's a CEO of a company, or when there's a politician who's on the way to a congressional hearing, they don't have time to hear the long-winded version of all the ways in which you're passionate about hunting. What they want to hear is what's often called the elevator pitch. And this is a metaphor. The idea of the elevator pitch is you're talking to somebody important. They've agreed to listen to what you have to say, but they've also set up some ground rules. Like, I'm in a hurry. Let's get on the elevator on floor 1. You need to persuade me by the time I get off for my meeting on floor 10. So this is a reason to be organized in your speaking, organized in your delivery, organized in what you're going to talk about first, because time is limited. There's also a third kind of broader reason why time-limited context exists, and this is getting a little bit philosophical, but we live in a time where society is overloaded with information. You know, it's no longer the case that there's just one dusty book in the library. There's all of Google that's at your fingertips to research whatever you like. You know, I'm mildly interested in woodworking, so there's no limit on YouTube videos I can watch to learn about this. When you're decompressing and you want to watch a TV show, you have endless channels on streaming and seasons that you can choose to watch from. What this all means is that psychologically, humans have a little bit of an effect of they're always thinking about what they might want to do next, and they're always sifting through lots and lots and lots of information. So it's really important to be concise, to be direct, and get to the point quickly, because in the back of everyone's mind is a little bit of an overload of information that everybody's dealing with a little bit. Okay, so I've established that context of persuasion are time limited. So what's the offense defense part? So offense, an offensive argument is when you say something bad's going to happen if we don't advocate hunting. If hunting diminishes, if it fades out of popularity, if cultural acceptance of hunting goes away, it's not just that it's going to wither on the vine, there's actually some bad impact that will occur as a result of that. And then conversely, another type of offense is, what is the benefit of hunting, right? So in a world that broadly accepts hunting, what types of risks and harms are averted? What sorts of initial things do people get, et cetera? So this is kind of ties into what Sam was talking about with net benefits. So for example, a package of offense would be something like a world without hunting is a world where species go extinct. It's a world where imbalances in nature lead to very pernicious, counterproductive results for the very animals that you care about. And oh, by the way, it happens to be the case that if you legally license hunters, they're also going to take care of that deer that would have crossed your path when you were driving a car to work that morning. So that's a net benefit of hunting. Each of those things is offense. It's like a reason that's very binary that forces a decision on the listener to decide, do I care about safety? Do I care about animal life? If those are impacts I care about, these are offensive considerations. So what is defense? Well, defense is when you mitigate and diminish somebody else's argument. You say, well, the thing that you said is bad is not that bad. Or the thing that you think you solved, you don't solve as effectively as you do. And the real lesson to learn here is that you can have an endless litany of defensive arguments. And at the end, there will still be some scaffolding of their argument left. And it might be sufficient as a reason to prefer their side. So if somebody doesn't solve that much, if somebody's not that effective, well, they still solve something. They're still somewhat effective. And that might be a reason to prefer them. So you really have to incorporate offensive arguments and then pair that towards the bottom of your pitch with some defense. So let's take a look at this in a situation, right? Well, let's think about 3 different ways it might play out. So humans, they're risk averse. They want to avoid impacts. If you only make defensive arguments, it's unlikely that you'll persuade because the focus has all been on the other side and you have not generated any offense yourself. What if you only generate offensive arguments? Well, that's an interesting one. It's tricky because then you could have offensive arguments and the other side could have offensive arguments, but the audience doesn't really know how to evaluate them because nobody has diminished either side's side. And I'll get into examples momentarily. But the real nugget, the thing that you want to aim for is a well-constructed speech or presentation that prioritizes offense and then selectively picks and chooses some defense to pair with that, with the knowledge that you won't be able to make all your defensive arguments. The clock will run out, the elevator will get off at floor number 10, and you're done. You're done in your opportunity to persuade. So prioritize offense and then incorporate some defense. Let's look at some examples. Okay, so what do I have here? I kind of have a map like a mental map of what somebody's anti-hunting pitch would look like and what the pro-hunting response might look like on the right. And what the red bar means on the bottom is the time that you did not have when the elevator got off on floor number 10, when the 5-minute interview was cut off because they went to a commercial, when you no longer were able to generate your additional arguments, right? So anything that's said in the area that is red does not get communicated. It does not even have an opportunity to persuade anybody because you ran out of time. So what does the anti-hunting group do? Well, they might start with nothing but offensive arguments. They might say, okay, animals have a nervous system and they feel pain. There's a moral wrong to inflict pain. That's one type of offense. It's a moral argument. And I grabbed these, by the way, from the How to Talk About Hunting book in terms of some of the things that people gravitate to different valences in terms of what persuades them. They might throw in a trophy hunting zinger in there. They'll say, well, trophy hunters hunt species that also sometimes have diminished populations. So they're going to make an argument against conservation, that it's counterproductive. And then they're going to appeal to a person's desire to be safe and to avoid adverse impacts. You know, nobody wants their family to be killed in an accident. So they say stray bullets from hunting harm other humans. So they've got 3 offensive arguments. And how might a not so well pitched presentation respond? Well, you'll say, it's not that bad. The pain is brief if you use certain methods of hunting as opposed to others. And by the way, legal prevalent regulated hunting is more prevalent than trophy hunting. So you haven't really said that the trophy hunting doesn't occur. You've just said that legal regulated hunting is more prevalent. And then also, by the way, diminishing a population is not the same as making the population extinct, right? So this animal population got smaller in number, but it didn't die out entirely, so it's not that bad. Oh, and by the way, there's hunter safety courses, which may prevent stray bullets. Well, here's how an audience member might evaluate this. I've heard a bunch of defensive arguments why hunting is not that bad, but I don't know why hunting is good. And when I listen to the other side, I've got at least some compelling arguments why hunting might decisively be bad. In other words, the anti-hunting side has presented offense, and you've taken up all the space of your speech time to just generate defense, and you didn't get to any offense. So the conclusion in an audience's mind just might be, I think I like the anti-hunting side. Okay, so let's look at this one. When you only make offensive arguments, so the same stuff on the left, but different stuff on the right. So the pro-hunting side says, okay, hunting prevents animal suffering from overpopulation and starving. That's their offense, and that is an argument, right? Also, hunting aids conservation because it causes flourishing of animals in variety and number, right? That's offense about the benefits of legal regulated hunting, and the focus is there. And also, trophy hunting generates funds for conservation and offense. Notice that there's not offense to respond to the stray bullets argument because you're already kind of running out of time, right? The speech time is evaporating. So here's what's a little bit tricky about this situation. Each side has offense, but it's not clear to an audience how to evaluate it because there is the undiminished existence of their offense weighed against the full weight of your offense as it's stated. So in an audience's mind, they're left wondering. They don't know. Nobody's giving them direction. Some number of animals feel pain during the kill. Is it hundreds? Is it thousands? I don't know. And some number of starving animals are also saved by the suffering of hunting. Is that hundreds or thousands? I also don't know, right? So the scale has not been conveyed. You didn't generate defense to diminish their side. So everything kind of gets its full weight and it's floating out there. There's no means to comparison. You know, if I watched a debate like this, I might be like, okay, species die, but species also get saved. I have no idea how to weigh or evaluate these. Right? So what should you do instead? Well, our recommendation is combine offensive and defensive arguments and prioritize the offensive arguments. So just on that nugget that says animals have a nervous system and feel pain, and it's morally wrong to inflict pain, right? That's the anti-hunting argument. Your first line is your offense. Hunting actually prevents animal suffering because there's animals that starve, right? So that's a different way they would feel a very long-term pain from starvation if they weren't shot and killed. And by the way, in the instances where you do kill an animal, more modern hunting methods are attentive to minimizing pain. There's certain methods that mitigate it, et cetera, right? So if there's like a bar graph their offense started out like this, but you diminished it, and then you came back with a 1-2 punch of your own offense. Like, hey, don't you care about starvation? Don't you care about making sure animals don't wander around and starve? So that's like an offense-defense pair that I would say is powerfully effective at that first argument. Okay, so what if they say, well, trophy hunters often hunt species with diminished populations, right? This is an argument about trophy hunting. So it's definitely good and worthwhile to shift the frame and the idea back onto legal regulated hunting. And you could talk about how on net, on balance, more so than the one-shot instances of trophy hunting, that there's preservation of flourishing of animal life, etc. But you could also say, okay, I identify that people are sensitive about trophy hunting. So in instances where you know that the audience is a little bit, emotionally swayed by that particular argument, consider investing a little bit more offense, a little bit more additional defense. In other words, a little bit more of your speech time, at least in a condensed fashion, laying up more considerations. Like, hey, did you know that trophy hunting also generates funds for conservation because of the licenses, et cetera? In other words, when somebody has a really good argument that you think might persuade the other side, and you don't exactly have a slam dunk response, the collective weight of a few responses could kind of dampen that. What about this? What about this? What about this? And then move on. And then, yeah, you can add in your defense about hunter safety courses right at the end of the pitch, in case anyone in the audience is actually concerned about, the practice of hunting being unsafe. Clarify that there's procedures in place that make it safe. Now, you didn't get to some defensive arguments, right? Look over here in the red area. You didn't get to talk about how extinction shouldn't be conflated with a decreased number of species life. You didn't get to make the argument about stray bullets, in fact, being a very infrequent occurrence, which would have been additional defense to the hunting harm argument. But that's okay, because you have structured an argument in a very strategic fashion where you address each of their offense with kind of an offense-defense pair, and then something that's minor defense against one of the least important arguments. That's smart, right? That's actually deciding on what you're going to engage and how you're going to engage. Okay. So let's move on to another tactic. This is a completely different tactic. But the lesson here is choose your battles and prioritize what are called number twos. So I'm going to present to you a continuum. And this continuum roughly maps onto the how to talk about hunting continuum of animal rights, animal welfare, and dominionism. Somebody who's an animal rights person, let's talk about that person. They're against your side. They're ideologically invested in advance to oppose your side. There's somebody who may even have revulsion to the very ideas that you uphold, surely because of a high misunderstanding. But it's a sort of question like, how much is it worthwhile to engage and debate that person, right? That's kind of a good question to ask. Now, the number two is the middle ground. These are people that are ambivalent. They care about animals to some extent, but they also clearly think that it's okay to use animals for other purposes. They eat meat, they're concerned about animal welfare, but they wear leather shoes. This might be the honeypot in terms of where you want to strike when you're trying to fish for allies, right? This is where you might actually have converts to your cause. So maybe consider investing in number twos as opposed to fighting number ones, right? Your late night keyboard warrior Facebook conversations against number ones are going nowhere, but your ability to maybe convert people who are middle ground and ambivalent might be very productive. Number three is people who are already on your side. So people who are dominionists are on your side, maybe a more extreme version. But what I want to caution you is that it doesn't help you to only talk with your echo chamber, right? The people that already agree with you. And Mark talked a little bit about this last time. He said it's important to go out and talk about hunting. It's important to be proactive and seek out conversations and talk about the practice. So if you're just talking with your fellow hunters about hunting, you're doing no good to advance the cause, right? To sort of expand your stakeholder base. So what's the advice? Let's start at the bottom. If a person is a number one, they're an animal rights person, they're primed to oppose you. I would say only engage them if time allows, if you have the energy and the stomach for it. And then I would actually choose narrow, precise messaging, because quite frankly, you're not in a 20-minute conversation going to completely convince a number one that hunting is okay. but you might be able to convince them that it's empirically true that legal regulated hunting actually does conserve wildlife, right? So that a narrow victory might be possible. But even then, consider that in your conversation with them, you might not even be trying to persuade them. They're just pawns in your game. If there's an audience, if there's other people watching, doing a very professional job, engaging them well, and then having a very narrow, precise victory in terms of how the debate plays out or the conversation plays out could really impress somebody else in the audience, even if the number one walks away thinking the exact same things they always thought. So something to consider is engage in number one if there's a possibility of audience persuasion, but engaging in number one if it's just one-on-one is probably not productive, right? What about persuading in number three? Like I said, it's an echo chamber. Your time is better spent seeking out number two. So let's focus here on the number twos. So your modest goal should be, you don't need them to be dominionistic or themselves become hunters. They're already somewhat an overlay with your stakeholder base because they do use animals and think using animals in certain contexts is okay. So your job is just to widen that aperture, get them to realize that there's broader considerations, ways that they can care about animals, but also support hunting, and basically build them as being allies for your cause. So those are two major tactics, right? It's basically the tactic about prioritize number twos and prioritize offense in your arguments. So now I'm going to talk about formal communication strategies, right? This is chapter 10 of the How to Talk About Hunting book. So I'm going to take a particular chart and do a quick analysis, right? So what is this chart? This is a chart that's in the How to Talk About Hunting book that ranks what people consider a credible source. And way up there is a game warden with marine development and wildlife, and a biologist with the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, right? That's considered a credible source. In the middle is a professor of environmental science, which is kind of interesting. And then at the bottom is a spokesperson from a local sportsman's organization. So what I want you to think about is when you craft your messaging and you include testimonials or sources, credibility kind of splits up into expertise and experience. And the goal is to have a combination of both, right? So even though you might like a local sportsman, think about how an outsider perceives a local sportsman. You know, maybe they think, oh, that person is very passionate, they're involved in what they do, etc. But the perception might also be, oh, I just think they're biased, right? They just like hunting, and now they're here talking about hunting to rationalize what they happen to like. How does a professor rank? Well, a professor ranks maybe a little bit higher, right? Their expertise is high. Wow, they study this stuff in their scholarly, office. They know a lot about conservation, and they've learned things that are worthwhile. But can I really trust somebody where I don't know how often they actually go out in the wild? How much should I worry that they don't have field experience that really adds to their expertise? So the honeypot, once again, is a combination of experience and expertise, somebody that has a combination of both. And you might not have somebody that has both. Or maybe the professor does have both, but you need to clarify the way in which that they have both. So the goal is to sort of aim for spokespeople that have expertise and experience. So what should you do? What's the tactic? Well, when you credit your organization in print and media, don't just name them. Craft a really well-made self-description that communicates the credentials of your leads and staff and the nature and frequency of their involvement in the field. You could also choose testimonials that convey a combination of both. I've seen pamphlets and so forth where there's a breakout box that's, a quick anecdote from the perspective of a conservation biologist, but then there could also be a breakout box that's a testimonial from somebody that has a lot of field expertise. So the point of all this is when you don't communicate who is the speaker, when you don't say like, this is the person that's talking and this is why they're credible, your audience is unlikely to trust what you have to say, everything that follows upon that. People are risk averse, but they're kind of primed to sort of be like, I don't know what I think about this person. I need a reason to think I should believe them, and then maybe I'll listen to their message. So it's very important in your formal communication strategies to make sure you're constantly hammering home why you should believe this person, why you should believe this source, this organization, etc. So last thing to kind of piggyback on this, when you do too much in your communications, when you don't prioritize only the things that you are particularly expert on, there are some risks. So the lesson here is don't bite off more than you can chew, and make your formal communications very focused and precise, which is something that chapter 10, step number 2 emphasizes in particular. When you advocate too much, here's what might happen. You might basically misunderstand your goal. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to recruit a new hunter, or are you trying to move the needle on cultural acceptance? If you're trying to move the needle on cultural acceptance, a small victory, right, persuading a precise point that animal conservation is aided by hunting could be sufficient. There's also a risk of information overload, right? If you try to give somebody a book on why hunting is good, they might not want to read the book, but they might be very amenable to a pamphlet with a few nuggets of information. Also, there's a risk of overreach. When you try to advocate and explain too much, and only like 5% of it is your particular area of expertise, what happens when they start quizzing you on the other 95%, right? Wouldn't it have been better to refer to your other fellow experts, people or other advocates in the field and their organizations, like they're better able to take up this question? And I kind of think of this like as an opportunity cost, right? I presume when you're hunting with your friends, somebody sometimes has the more optimal shot than you do. You should let other people take their shot when they have the optimal shot. And those could be your allies with various organizations in hunting. So, all right, let's move on, Sam, to talking about fallacies, understanding fallacies.
Yeah. Fallacies are very important in lots of different ways. And, as Armands and I, we spend a lot of time teaching people about debate and argument and persuasion. And I love speaking to an audience. When I say the word debate, the first thing they think of is what you put on the hook to catch the fish. But that's my attempt at humor today. But the truth is if you can just point out that an argument has a logical flaw, that it's a fallacy of logic, then that's going to help you in a long way along the path of convincing someone that you're right and that those that disagree with you are wrong. And Armands and I, in preparation for today's presentation, we looked at anti-hunting messages, and they're filled with these fallacies. And so we thought we'd spend the remaining time that we have just kind of going over some of the common fallacies that we see in anti-hunting messages. And what we are advocating that you do is you point them out when you see them. And the first one is the red herring. This actually comes from this metaphor of the red herring actually comes from the field of hunting, the field of fox hunting, actually. So if any of you have ever been on a fox hunt, it takes a lot of time to get ready. You have to get all dressed up. You get your horses, you get on your horses, you get your dogs ready, your hounds ready, you get the guy that blows the trumpet, you got the whole big crew that's going to go on the formal fox hunt. And the last thing you want to happen is for it to be over right away. So you go find a really stinky fish or a red herring, a herring, which is a kind of fish that's been out in the sun for a while and is really starting to smell. And what you do is before the fox hunt begins, you tie a little string to the red herring and you drag it all around the field so that when the hounds are released or when the dogs are released to chase the fox, they actually are tempted to go after the smelly smell of the rotten fish and get off track. And so that's where the word red herring comes from, the phrase red herring comes from. And basically what is happening in a lot of situations with anti-hunters is they're throwing things out there that divert your attention away from the real issues. They're bringing up things that aren't really pertinent to the topic. Those are red herrings. And Armands, why don't you explain the examples real quick?
Okay, so let's say two people are conversing about whether or not hunting is moral, right? That's the discussion. And an argument is presented. And again, I took this from the data of the How to Talk About Hunting book, where people could make the argument, hunters are a natural part of the food chain, which at least makes hunting for meat permissible, right? And this is a moral argument that people might make in favor of hunting. Well, what if the person responds and says, all the ways humans relate to animals are unnatural? That includes keeping pets or having animals in cages at zoos, right? Whoa, what just happened there, right? So if you're not skilled at analysis of debate and persuasion, you might think, that sounds pretty good. You know, animal stuff bad. But really what happened is there's a sleight of hand that happened. Your opponent took the discussion of naturalness in animals and they started to introduce a red herring. They started to discuss other things that are about animals and whether it's natural or not, namely zoos and having pets. And they started to refute that and talk about why that's problematic. But just like bad fox hunt, this is off track, right? This conversation's off the rails. So think about what Sam said with his identify, beat, mean method, right? You could go back to this and say, look, I'm going to identify that you have committed a red herring fallacy. You're basically diverting from my point because we're here to discuss a very precise thing, which is hunting and naturalness, not the naturalness or not naturalness of zoos. So then beat the argument, explain why going through a food chain process of procuring your food is something that's been around since time immemorial, and it's a very natural thing. And then what does this mean? It means that I have an ethical, practical reason why hunting is good, offense, right? That would be an instance of walking your opponent through the paces of, you said something that's misleading, you're off track, let me identify what it is, let me defeat it, and let me explain to you why I'm right.
I don't think it's wrong to just say, hey, I'm willing to defend legal, regulated hunting, but don't make me defend poaching or non-legal, unregulated hunting. That's not what you're for. So don't get tricked into following a red herring.
Yeah, I would say one of the, at least from Sam's and I's research and then our discussion with our friends at HLF, it seems like there's often a red herring that happens when people try to shift the conversation away from legal regulated hunting. And then they conflate all kinds of practices with legal regulated hunting, when the thing that you might want to talk about is just the benefits of legal regulated hunting.
Armand and I watched a debate about hunting, a pro-hunting, anti-hunting debate, where the debate was supposed to be about hunting in general. And it ended up being boiled down to whether or not it was okay to kill, Sissel the lion. That really wasn't what the debate was about or should have been about. But unfortunately, the red herring had been followed by or been allowed to be introduced into the debate. The next fallacy we want to tell you about is called the straw person fallacy. Pre-political correct times, it was called the straw man fallacy. But basically, the idea behind it is that it's easier to knock down a scarecrow, a straw person, as opposed to a real person. And so basically what happens here is people, when you're talking to them and you're explaining your arguments, they mischaracterize your arguments to make them easier so they could knock them down. And what you need to do when you're in this situation is point it out. That's not what I said. You're mischaracterizing my argument. And Armand, maybe you can explain your example.
So this example is a little bit similar to red herring, but there are some differences. So if somebody says legal regulated hunting is effective for generating revenue that ultimately benefits wildlife, and then they say, well, hunting should be banned because hunters who are poachers create a market for the parts of endangered animals, which hurts wildlife. What they've done is they've mischaracterized which type of hunting you're talking about, right? So they presented a distorted or warped view of the precise and narrow version of your advocacy. So they're still talking about hunting, right? That's the difference with the previous example, because the previous example went off the rails and talked about zoos and other things. But they have distorted what you actually advocate with respect to hunting to introduce something that's a diversion.
I actually, if you go to YouTube and you type in anti-hunting YouTube, the first thing that comes up on Google is a woman who in 2012, not that long ago, was on 60 Minutes talking about why hunting's bad. And of course, all her arguments are about why not fair chase hunting is bad, why animals in a penned-in area, hunting those people are bad, but she extrapolates it to meaning all hunting. And we all know that's not what hunting is. But right now, this is what this was 60 Minutes. This is a major way that people get information. And that was her argument. She was committing the straw person fallacy. And so when this happens, you need to point out right away that you are mischaracterizing my arguments. I'm not arguing for, unfair chase hunting or animals pinned in a little area and that you shoot them, right? We're talking about hunting in general. And when you extrapolate from the little to the large, you're just basically using the straw person fallacy.
Okay, so the next fallacy is a selection fallacy.
Why don't you explain that one, Armand?
Okay, so I think this is very interesting because Mark was talking about certain pictures that are presented of hunts where a hunter is showing, the animal that they had hunted. But when these show up without context, without certain other details supplied, it lends itself to a different interpretation, which is why it's very important in terms of your messaging, in terms of what you share on social media, that you are in control of the full context and you're not displaying something that can be decontextualized, right? Sort of argued differently. So selection fallacy is when somebody presents a false interpretation because they prioritize some relevant evidence, but then they just exclude or discount other relevant evidence. So it's like a warped presentation of an anecdote, a situation, etc. So what if somebody told you, hey, that person just senselessly murdered that horse. The horse was alive and breathing, and then they gave him a lethal injection. That's horrible, right? I suppose, if you like horses, you might say, yeah, I guess that sounds senseless. But what if it turned out that there were other details that are now not included, right? The horse had a broken leg, right? When a horse has a broken leg, it cannot stay still long enough for the break to heal. There's circulation problems that kick in. There's going to be a lot of suffering for that horse, and it's not going to remedy itself, right? It's actually a good thing to mitigate suffering to give it the lethal injection. Well, then that would make you think much, much differently about whether that in fact was or was not senseless. So the full context of an anecdote of hunting or an image of a hunter with the thing that they've hunted can be very important to fight back against a misinterpretation via a selection fallacy.
Great.
Okay.
I think we have time for maybe one more, Armand.
All right, I'll do it real quick if that's okay.
Yeah.
Arrangement fallacy. So this is when somebody basically presents a shopping list or a laundry list, and the things are not similar. They're not actually in the same categories or types of things, and it's a different type of sleight of hand. So if somebody says, hey, you know what? I don't think conservation's been successful. Sure, 20 or 30 species have been saved, but millions of deer have been killed. And it's also the case that in grassy areas, anywhere you can think of, big shopping malls get built. So I don't exactly think that wildlife and conservation has been preserved. Well, what's misleading about this is that it's like apples and oranges, right? The discussion of species was by type of species, not by quantity of animal. But the number 30 species saved versus 500 million sounds very disparate. Well, that's because the 500 million number is just talking about the number of deer that are killed, right? I'm just making up a number, but you get my point. And then the discussion about the shopping malls in natural areas, yeah, that speaks to wildlife and I guess to the extent that they need a habitat. But there's a deeper discussion to be had about what are the appropriate habitats for various wildlife, right? A wetland is different than the grassy area, 2 blocks from my house. So people sometimes like to present like a big list of things, and then in the middle is the thing that they wanted to make seem ridiculous or not that important or somehow ineffective. And then your job is to identify that these things are not alike, that there's a sort of conflation between these different things, and that saving 20 to 30 species via legal regulated hunting is in fact very meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, to conclude, I'd just like to say that Armand and I have sort of taken a very systematic effort to research hunting and anti-hunting. And at least I have concluded, and I believe Armand has as well, is all the good arguments are on the pro-hunting side. There's a long history of the connection between hunting and conservation. It goes back to Aldo Leopold, one of the founders of the conservation movement. His first book he ever wrote was called Game Management. I mean, it's really important that people that are advocates for hunting don't let the anti-hunters get away with shady reasoning, bad arguments, and communication strategies that can potentially be effective in persuading people, but not on strong grounds. And so this is why Armands and I want to make everybody that we meet and talk to about this issue as strong an advocate as possible. And that means a couple different things. You, first of all, have to educate yourself about the facts. And lots of the data, Mark Duda presented in the earlier webinars last week, that basically show that how people feel or how people might feel about certain issues. The second thing is, not only do you need data, but you need to be able to figure out what's the best way I can present this so I don't turn people off. I mean, maybe with certain audiences, you can get away with it, and other audiences you can't, but you need to be sensitive that there are some ways to say things that will be more effective than others. Mark said last week, he said, it's not what you say, it's what they hear. Nothing could be more true. And so in my concluding remarks, I want you to be the best debater you can be. I want you to be the best persuader you can be. I want you to be the best hunting advocate you can be. And that means you need to think strategically about persuasion. And I think that's what today's seminar attempted to do. Armands, do you want to conclude with anything?
No, Sam, I think that's a great wrap up. So good luck, everybody. And we hope you enjoyed what we had to present for you.
All right. Thanks, guys. That was awesome. I love that you brought up The Art of Woo. I've had this book for a long time. When I was working in the field of working with a lot of volunteers, having to persuade them was very important. And that book helped me a lot. It has a lot more ramifications on our lives besides just trying to talk about hunting. It's a good book. Thanks again. I hopefully done a good job last week of presenting you with the science or the facts about how to talk about hunting. And today we tried to marry that with the science of communication, because as Sam and Armand said, there's certain ways to stage your argument or what you're trying to talk about to get your point across the best. And they are by far the best at it of the people that I know. Hopefully you'll join us tomorrow. It's the big day. We're going to sum everything up and give you some real good meat takeaways and answer some of your questions. So we'll see you tomorrow.